Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on the junction of Bishopsbridge Road and Portchester Terrace North in Bayswater, W2. One street east of Barbara Shuttleworth's shooting. Directly opposite the attacks by the old lady killer. And a short walk from the crime spree of the Chenless Wonder. Coming soon to Murder Mile. At a little T-junction off Portchester Terrace North sits a give-way sign. And usually a long line of truly useless drivers, all eagerly waiting to get snarled up behind the choking fumes of trucks. Only to first get wedged behind a learner driver struggling to find first gear. A yummy mummy whose talons scratch rainbows into the windscreen every time she turns the steering wheel. Or cyclists, either taking an age to fix their feet to their stupid clippy-cloppy cleats, or darting from the road to the path and then back again, shouting,
"Oh, look at me! I'm a vehicle. Now I'm a pedestrian. Now I'm a vehicle again. The rules don't apply to me."
Until, of course, they get strawberry jammed onto the number 27 bus to Baker Street. Good. Life is not a game. But for two boys with an SAS fixation, it was. Saturday the 15th of January 1994, at roughly 1 a.m. At this junction, 19-year-olds Jamie Petrolini and Richard Elsey stood dressed in black, like SAS soldiers on a deadly mission. Armed with a combat knife. Whereas some boys play cops and robbers, or cowboys and Indians. Being stuck in a bizarre world of fantasy and initiations. Their playtime had become a reality, and soon an innocent man would be butchered. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 256. The Initiation. Far from being driven to kill, owing to hardship, both of these boys had come from privilege. Born in 1975, Jamie Petrolini had the kind of upbringing that most kids would dream of. Raised in the tiny hamlet of Cromdale, in the rugged Spey Valley in the northeast of Scotland. Every morning he would open his window to stunning glens, fresh streams and highland cattle. As the only child of Johnny and Wanda, being Polish and Italian post-war immigrants who ran a cafe and an ice cream parlour, their long hours had blessed him with a good home, a happy life, and the privileges which had been denied them as children. Only Jamie didn't see it like that, as all he saw was heather and sheep. Claiming, "I was on my own a lot. I grew up with nearly no contact with others. No siblings and no best friends. Just his collie dog, Jake." Keen for him to do well, his parents sent him to Aberlour, a prestigious £11,000 a year prep school, and later being educated at Gordonston, the elite Scottish public school as attended by King Charles. For some, it's seen as the best education that money can buy. But for Jamie, it was just another form of isolation. A boarding school stuffed with pompous little scroats, with no emotion except arrogance. Bullied and demoralised, although he struggled to fit in, sport became his saving grace. As he busied himself with rugby, canoeing and parachuting, becoming leader of the running group, captain of the karate team, and such an accomplished skier that he almost made it onto the Scottish national team. Age 14, growing into a small and silent action man, his dream was to join the Marines. But lacking a decent attention span, and often drifting into the realms of fantasy as he sat in desperate solitude. Having failed his A-levels, his university scholarship bid was futile, and his army application was rejected. (1990 to 1991) saw the invasion of Kuwait and the war in Iraq, all of which were as heavily televised as the Iranian embassy siege by the SAS in 1980. With Bravo 20, Andy McNabb's SAS memoir being released in 1993, it was a time of heroes and bravery. Only Jamie Petrolini was part of none of it. As a sullen, sensitive boy, what he needed was a mentor to guide him. What he ended up with was a deluded fantasist. Like Jamie, Richard Elsey's upbringing was the epitome of privilege. Raised in the leafy, upper-middle-class enclave of Wilton Road in Beaconsfield, Buckinghamshire, his English father and Iranian mother had also sent their only son to Brockhurst Prep School, Merchant Taylor's Public School, and later doing his A-levels at Dr. Challoner's Grammar School in Amersham. They had hopes that he'd study at Oxford University. Both boys were isolated and anxious, but whereas Jamie had sports as the antidote to his insecurity, Richard was described as quiet and passive, a reserved chap, and not a natural mixer. There's a shy boy who many said, when he left the room, he left no trace that he was even there. Being keen to join the army, but knowing that he lacked the confidence and the physical frame being too slightly built, he tried to rebel. It was all a bit pathetic. He took up smoking, he collected knives, and he stole a travel card from his friend, only to pretend it was an SAS identity card, which it looked nothing like. But lies can also belie a much darker side. Having agonized that the real me is hiding from my present self. And he also spoke of his great grief, seeing his sister killed. Writing in his journal, blood was everywhere. On my clothes, on the car, on the road, on my soul. It seems as though my sister, my one true source of love, has been lost since the beginning of time. Only there was just one problem. Richard had always been an only child. As a morose, lonely boy, what he needed was a friend. But what he wanted was someone to dominate. Someone like Jamie. In September 1993, by chance, both boys were sent to Modes in Oxford to resit their A-levels. Described by the principal, Dr. Stephen Moore, as young and immature, they behaved strangely, as if they were plotting something. And although neither were happy, together they'd met their soulmate. They would be friends for just 4 months. Neither had a history of violence, cruelty, drugs or drink. They had suffered no trauma, no accidents, and no bullying beyond what is seen as the norm. They were just two privileged, middle-class misfits who'd found solace in a shared fantasy of being soldiers. It all started harmlessly enough. In October 1993, as that month's best-selling book, Richard purchased Andy McNabb's Bravo 20, the partially true story of an SAS patrol stuck behind enemy lines in Iraq, which became his obsession. Devouring every code word, such as SOP for Standard Operating Procedures, E&E for Escape and Evasion, and being littered with comical and racially insensitive terms, like officers being Ruperts and Arabs being ragheads. Its words became his mantra. Recording his favourite phrases onto tape so he could learn them verbatim. Being tired became on your chin strap. Beaten up became filled in. And with slotting, meaning to kill, he'd repeat, "You never kill. You slot the little ragheads if they get in your way." Every teen has a dark obsession. But it wasn't anything to really worry about, because Richard was so timid. Sharing the book with Jamie, who loved it as much as Richard did, Richard's mantra became Jamie's as he mentored his Special Forces fledgling on the ways of the SAS. They'd state,
There is no failure. You just follow the SOP. Fear? There is no fear, because there's no feeling.
and rejecting any family or feeling because
If you're worried about people getting hurt and killed, you'd spend your whole life on antidepressants. They're only people. Slime, or dickheads, or wankers. Here today, rat shit tomorrow.
ditching their college uniforms. By the winter of 1993, the boys were dressed in black like a baby-faced battalion. It was just harmless fun. A fashion fad. And like most teens, they wanted to be unique, but dressed identical to fit in. Along with the grief he'd shed for the dead sister who never existed, Richard told Jamie that he was a second lieutenant in the Paras and offered to train him based on his experiences as an SAS recruit. It was all a lie. Everyone else knew that, except Jamie. So whether he believed it or wanted to believe it is unknown. But having also expressed some homosexual longings, was this a friendship or was it love? Jamie would later state,
He was my best friend. Why would he lie? He lectured me about good and evil, glory and pride, and still wanted to join the Marines. I became a clone of him, arrogant and brash.
By day, Richard had him marching through the streets of Oxford. By night, he had him blacked up and crawling on his belly through the undergrowth as if he was hunting an enemy sniper. And sometimes, as ordered by Richard's fictional commanding officer to test Jamie's mettle, they went on missions. Akin to little kids dressing up in their older siblings' clothes, adopting a deeper voice, and drawing on a stubble so they'd look old enough to buy cigarettes and alcohol. Their real-world missions were just silly little games. In November 1993, posing as Captain T.G. Walker and Lieutenant Chris Winter, they claimed they took a room at the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington and arranged for the bill to be sent to the army, which seems unlikely. They said they walked into a wedding reception and stole a bottle of vodka and celebrated a successful mission by swapping the breakfast orders hanging from the hotel room's doorknobs. It was hardly the epitome of an SAS mission, and it's uncertain if any part of it was even true. Later that month, they also walked into the Golden Horseshoe Casino in Bayswater, pretending to be CID officers there to root out gangsters. But with these baby-faced teens having no ID and no idea, they were booted out by the manager and the bouncer. They had chosen that casino at random. And that was also their only prior link to their victim. That they'd once been in the same room, but not at the same time. Jamie and Richard were two stupid little boys who were as incompetent as they were cowardly. And yet, a few weeks later, they would brutally murder a stranger for an SAS initiation, which didn't exist. At college, their attendance was bad, their coursework was shambolic, and having found each other, they'd become even more isolated. Their fantasy had become a reality, with Richard believing that he was recruiting Jamie as a member of the Special Forces, and that soon Jamie would fulfill his dream. Jamie later said,
I was an automaton. Richard was the murderer, and I was just the knife.
Or so he'd say. Day and night, they talked of nothing but killing, quoting Andy McNabb.
Be a sniper. Headshots only. If you're not good enough, don't bother. Be a man. Be a killing machine.
But that's all it was. Talk. In what they described as the murder book, Richard had Jamie copy down all of the ways that Richard said he should kill.
From behind. Hand over mouth. Stab the heart once. Hold until dead. Insert knife at the top of the vertebrae. Sever spinal cord and brain. Wrench to the left. Sever jugular vein. Note, lots of spray.
And although some may call this killing,
Andy McNabb called it giving them the good news.
with Jamie's basic and plagiarized training coming to an end after just 2 months, Richard set him his final assignment. Agreeing to do it on his birthday, Friday the 14th of January 1994, having brought a Fairburn Sykes commando knife, Jamie was now planning first blood. That morning, the boys caught the bus from Oxford to London, Victoria. In their minds, the mission was simple. As Richard told Jamie,
"We're going to kill someone. It's an SAS test for you, ordered by my boss. There is no good or evil, only tasks to be done quickly and efficiently. We'll go to King's Cross. Wear rough clothes, or we'll stick out like the balls on a bulldog. Wear gloves, and carry a bag for the blood-stained clothes. You think of everything. Then you act. You fucking do it."
who they would kill was irrelevant.
So we decided to slot a pimp or a drug pusher. Not a real person.
That was the plan. But when they actually came to doing the dirty deed, rather than just bragging about it, they cacked it. On the doorstep of the Flying Scotsman pub on Caledonian Road, Jamie asked the female bouncer,
I'm sorry to ask. I don't want to be rude, but do you know where we can find some pimps?
Head into the Molten Hops pub a few doors down. In the toilets, both boys got dressed up like budget ninjas going apple picking, wearing army boots, sunglasses, black woolen hats and black gloves, which was deeply suspicious, especially in an era when IRA bombings were still prevalent in London. But with the barman growing suspicious as they'd hogged the toilets for too long, he asked them to leave. In King's Cross, which is a hotbed of sex and drugs, they said they couldn't find a pimp or a drug dealer. They'd failed before they'd even begun, and not through a lack of targets, but owing to their cowardice. For months, they'd bragged so much, with Richard as the mentor and Jamie as his student. Only now, they both felt a deep sense of shame and betrayal at their failure. But running through their minds was Andy McNabb's words.
There is no failure. You just follow the SOP. Fear? There is no fear because there's no feeling.
So with this decision being as random as the roll of a dice, they took the Central Line tube to Queensway. Their victim, they had never met. They didn't know his name, and they didn't care. "44-year-old Mohamed Abbas Nassif El-Sayed was born in Cairo, Egypt. Having trained as a chemistry teacher, he came to London in 1976 to continue his education. 4 years later, at the Empire Ballroom in Leicester Square, he fell in love. His wife Susan would state, "I looked at him, and he saw me, and we danced together all night. Somehow, I knew we would be together forever." Married in Hackney in 1981. That night, he cried because he was so happy at finding me. I just hugged him. Described as a gentle giant. As a hard-working husband with 2 young sons, Sharif aged 7 and Tariq aged 3. By day, Mohammed supported his family by working as a chef. As by night, he let off a little steam at the Golden Horseshoe Casino in Queensway. For Mohammed, it had been an unremarkable day. At 6 p.m, he had dinner with his family, never knowing that it would be his last. At 7 p.m, he kissed his boys goodbye as he took them into bed, unaware that he would never see their faces again. At 7:30 p.m, having picked up his friend Yasser Hammoud's in his silver blue Audi, they headed to the casino. Always smartly dressed, polite, and wearing thick tinted glasses owing to an eye condition, Mohammed was said to be a sweetie who was no bother to anyone. After midnight, he dropped his friend home. And although he was happy to be heading back to his family, he was a little sad having lost £300. Only his night was about to get worse. The 2 tragic teens had failed their misguided mission to slaughter a stranger on the supposed orders of a fictional SAS chief. With his chest puffed out, Richard strutted and barked like a cut-price Rambo, as Jamie, his deluded subordinate, who would do anything never to be lonely, skulked in the cold darkness. By about 1 a.m, the junction of Bishopsbridge Road and Portchester Terrace North was deathly quiet, as a low fog rolled in along the tree-lined street. In the half an hour they'd stood by the give way sign, 10 cars had passed. 10 potential victims, all of which they'd rejected for one reason or another. Another failure was looming, and the boys knew it. But as the silver-blue Audi approached, chosen at random, it was now or never. Richard barked, "Him!" And that was it. Jamie dived into the passenger seat, with Richard in the back, and slipping the razor-sharp combat knife to Mohamed's throat. Jamie ordered,
"Drive round here."
As at a creeping 10 miles per hour, the car rolled up the well-lit street towards Paddington Station. It was a pointless move by two inexperienced idiots, having gone from a dark, secluded side street to a much busier bus route, and having travelled no more than 70 metres. Jamie spat,
"Pull in here."
The Audi was parked on Bishopsbridge Road, outside of several unlit houses on Gloucester Gardens. With the engine off and the interior in darkness, Jamie turned to Richard and said,
"Rich?"
as if he was awaiting his orders. Only Richard said nothing. He simply froze, as now the fantasy had become reality. As planned in their murder book, Jamie would brag,
"I struck him under the Adam's apple, just to the left of the neck, and severed a vein."
As expected, there was a lot of blood. But what wasn't expected was that Mohamed would fight back, as he grabbed the knife's blade with his bare hands and tried to flee. Jamie also boasted, as if he was recounting his own SAS memoir of bullshit.
Richard was holding him from the back seat. After a couple of seconds, I changed the target. It was a direct stab to the heart. The knife went in all the way up to the hilt. I left it there for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then I pulled it out. I turned to Richard and I said, "Jesus, there's a lot of blood."
And within minutes, Mohamed was dead. Pointlessly stealing the car keys and his glasses for no reason other than as a cruel souvenir, these two deluded losers saluted each other on a mission well done and fled into the night, leaving a hat behind. Callously admitting to a psychiatrist, Jamie said,
I walked off as if nothing had happened. I enjoyed the killing.
As on the bus back to Oxford, Jamie opened his birthday cards as Richard fell asleep. Eight hours later, at 9:20 a.m, a traffic warden found Mohamed slumped in his seat. A crime scene was established, but with no fingerprints, no witnesses and no motive. The culprits were a mystery. It was a baffling crime with no real chance of a conviction. But not being real soldiers, these two pathetic little boys couldn't help but gloat. said to be a private joke. At a Burger King, Jamie put on the glasses, donned the bloodstained gloves, bit into a ketchup sachet, and he let it pour down his chin to mock the dead man's last moments alive. Having bragged about
doing some slotting as a regular thing.
Not realizing that he wasn't living in a fantasy world, Jamie boasted about the murder to two friends, his flatmate, and even his father. With the school principal informed, CID were called, and both boys were arrested. Tried at the Old Bailey in autumn 1994, both boys blamed each other for the murder. Examined by psychiatrists, although no sign of psychopathy was found in Richard, Jamie's lawyers posited the defense that he was suffering from early-stage schizophrenia at the time of the crime. But a plea of manslaughter by diminished responsibility was rejected by the prosecution and the jury. The jury deliberated for 5 hours, returning with a 10-2 majority verdict on Mohamed's 45th birthday. On the 8th of November 1994, Jamie Petrolini and Richard Elsey were both sentenced to life in prison. Summing up, Judge Neil Dennison QC stated,
"You were both playing out your fantasies. It started with harmless pranks and progressed to the brutal and senseless slaughter of a complete stranger."
In reaction, Mohamed's widow Susan said, "I'll never forgive them. They are evil. They should never be freed. My boys may never have the wealth or opportunities that they had, but we are a far better class of people than those two. My life is a misery, and I'm fighting to keep afloat. But at least I can hold my head up high and say that I am a civilized citizen, unlike those animals." On the 14th of June 2012, following a legal fight by his family, with the Court of Appeal having recognised that Jamie's responsibility for the killing was significantly impaired by his mental illness, his murder conviction was quashed and he was committed to a hospital order. Having served 18 years of his life sentence in prison, aged 36, Richard Elsey was released in February that same year. And even though it was his SAS fantasy which drove both of them to kill, conversely, he was never diagnosed as mentally unwell.